So welcome to the third workshop in the New England Regional Milkshed Workshop series about planning to reduce the impact of foreign animal disease outbreaks. This is one part of a project called A Systems Approach to Securing the New England Milk Supply in the Event of a Foot and Mouth Disease Outbreak. And I am Julie Smith. I am a research professor at the University of Vermont and the project director. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge our funding from USDA NIFA and make it very clear that any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this presentation or through the project materials are those of myself and the project team and should not be construed to represent any official USDA or US government determination or policy. Whether dealing with foot and mouth disease or some other highly contagious emergency disease, the USDA response goals are the same. First and foremost, find and contain disease, eradicate the disease if possible, and to the extent possible, facilitate continuity of business, that's the COB, for non-infected animals and non-contaminated animal products. One of the reasons that I put COB in quotes here is that continuity of business in the context of secure food supply plans, which addresses movements of things that are caught within a control area, is just a small part of the challenge to continuity of business for susceptible livestock industries in the event of a disease that has international trade ramifications. So if there's international trade disruptions of our major commodities, that has a pretty significant impact on markets because we export such a huge proportion of products. And the dairy industry, as some of you may know, is always having a bit of a continuity of business issue, or at least in many places is having challenges just due to the standard day-to-day economic environment that we're in. The graphic on the screen is showing farm gate milk prices in dollars per 100 pounds of milk shipped for the last 10 years. And you see that this price goes up and down on a fairly regular basis. And if you just look at the beginning of 2026 versus a year ago, you'll note that the price dropped 25%. And there aren't too many people with jobs who are happy about a 25% pay cut as they go into a new year. So with that in the backdrop, we need to think about our preparedness and response plans for an emergency disease. And one of these things is understanding what's in the 72-hour plan. And we talked about that a bit in the last couple workshops. We, for sure, to be successful, what happens in that 72 hours is really important. So having those plans ready to go is really critical. And having had input so that the affected industries and the state and federal responders are all on the same page is really critical. That's, again, one of the purposes of this project is to help us develop these plans. The federal response strategies indicate the importance of incorporating into planning local knowledge, having industry integrated with state and federal responders in the planning process, achieving or defining clearly obtainable goals that everybody can support, ensuring that all guidelines, strategies, and procedures are communicated effectively to responders and stakeholders, and trying to identify and resolve competing interests prior to an outbreak, if at all possible, and having the ability to address them quickly during an outbreak if needed. In the end, success looks like rapid foreign animal disease detection, tracing, and control. And I have put the yin yang up here to represent the interconnectedness and sometimes the challenges between the main efforts that are going on of surveillance and movement control, because they're both needed, but they're happening when there is competing claims for resource allocation. So we're going to talk about that a bit today. And another thing that's, I think, I don't think people overlook this, but I want to underscore the importance for people to understand this, the riskiness of the business that we're in if we're in the dairy industry. And I would say the dairy industry recognizes that business as usual puts them at a pretty high risk of having spread disease before it is first detected, because we realize that there's this lag between infection happening and our ability to see the signs of it and detect it and confirm it. And even that takes some time, right? When things may still be moving that could potentially move contamination that spreads infection. And we've seen this, right? So maybe not all of you are familiar with the outbreaks that happened in the United Kingdom. There was a very, very large outbreak in 2001 and a much smaller one in 2007. But we learned a lot from those. And the first thing was that movements of infected animals will spread disease at long distances. And after those animals have moved, or you could say after animals stop moving, the majority of spread is through indirect contact spread. So it's the ordinary business, things coming on and off of farms that can spread contamination. We saw that again in 2007 with an outbreak due to contaminated material being removed from a laboratory that studies foot and mouth disease and being transferred to a site that was right next to a beef farm, a beef paddock. And the farms that became infected were those that came in contact with contaminated material that had been physically driven into a paddock with animals. So we understand that indirect spread is possible and we need to control it. But farmers want to know, well, what do I do? Because what do I stop, right? So what are the highest risks? And so the question for us to put our 2 cents on today is the mirror on the wall, which is the riskiest of them all of these 4 service providers that are common on dairy farms. Which of these do we think is riskiest? I want the answers in the chat. And you can choose to either answer just the riskiest one, or for extra credit, rank them from riskiest to least risky in the chat. And I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. Actually, I'll give you about 15 or 20 seconds to do that. So we're going to move on to introduce today's discussions. Our discussions today are focusing on movement management, particularly requirements for requesting a permit to move things. And some groups more than others may get into some discussions of secure milk supply guidance. So to set the scene, I just want to give the big picture overview again of how USDA approaches emergency disease response. So the priorities obviously are to contain and eradicate foreign animal diseases if at all possible. And this involves applying rapidly tracing movements of animals and people that have come on and off of infected premises, quarantining those premises, which means keeping animals and other things from moving on and off of them, potentially destroying infected and exposed animals using approved methods. And a lot of the controls happen within what's called a control area. So those need to be established as quickly as possible, along with surveillance activities. And if the outbreak is in a place where there are populations of susceptible wildlife, obviously wildlife risk assessment and management need to start as well.